Good evening. Welcome and thank you for joining our class tonight titled Who is Really in Charge? And in this class, we're going to try to explain the origins of the great mistake of mankind, namely the decision to start to worship other things other than God, and how that evolved over time. Remember to visit us at bnacademy.org, or if you have any questions, please email askme at torahquestions.com. Ask me at Torah, Torah, questions, one word.com. So what I want to do first is read some verses from the book of Genesis. Okay, remember last week we spoke about, the past few weeks that is, we discussed the sin of Cain and the various lessons that we can learn from it. And remember that God said to him, as part of his punishment, that the seventh generations will be punished. And here we're going to learn how the seventh generation, in fact, killed Cain, and he was punished. It took 7 generations, exactly as God said. But that's not going to be the focus of our class tonight. So here it tells us how the seventh generation came about. And it tells us a descendant of Cain, and Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. Then it continues, and this is, by the way, chapter 4, verse 19, 20, and on. So verse 20, and Ada bore Yaval, or Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who dwell in the tents and amidst herds. We'll soon find out what that means. Verse 21, and the name of his brother was Yuval, or Jubal. He was the ancestor of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. And then it continues in verse 22. And Selah, she too bore a son. She bore Tubal Cain, you hear the name Cain, Tubal Cain, who forged the implements of copper and iron, and the sister of Tubal Cain is Naamah. So these verses tell us a lot. First of all, we're going to see, as we're going to see throughout the generations, a constant and unfortunate repeat of the 3 cardinal sins. In a previous class, we spoke about the 3 cardinal sins, and here you see it. And sadly, unfortunately, and almost predictably, mankind always gravitates back to those 3 sins in one way or another. So if you see over here, back to verse 19, it tells us his 2 wives. It makes a point to point out his 2 wives. It doesn't say, as it would typically say, and he bore these sons, regardless of who the wives are. What is it telling us? What really is the lesson here? What is the value of knowing his wives? So we have one of the primary commentaries, perhaps the most authoritative and original commentary on the Torah, on the Bible, that gives us basic and absolute insight into understanding the verses. And he tells us as follows: 2 wives. Why does the Torah point out that there's 2 wives? Why does the Bible have to emphasize 2 wives? It could have just said the 2 names, and we understand that it's 2 different people, because it's pointing something out. And he says like this, and I'm going to read it. This was the custom of the generation that lived before the time of the flood. They had 2 wives, one for childbearing, and the other for frivolous companionship and charm. The latter was given a cup of some drug to drink in order that she might become barren, that she wouldn't have children, and was dressed up like a bride and fed the best food, whilst her fellow wife was left without her husband's companionship and ever mourned like a widow. And thus the names, the Hebrew names, the one Ada is a certain connotation of mourning, as if like somebody who was not happy, somebody who was in a sad state, because she was the one that was just for childbearing, and she was like not in the presence of her husband most of the time. She wasn't there as a charm, so she wasn't charmed either. Whereas Tzila comes from the word sail, which means shadow. She was always in the shadow of her husband. So I want to take a moment, take a pause here and think, what is this telling us? These are people that, if you think about it, they're there in the beginning of mankind, especially someone like Lamech, knowing what his great grandfather did, knowing the destruction that came to the world in such a premature time. The world wasn't even that old yet. Mankind wasn't even yet propagated as it should be. And already such great havoc was wrought on mankind. Shouldn't he have been more focused with loftier and more idealistic objectives? Shouldn't he have been focused on how to procreate in a manner that can make the world a better place? And yet, what was his way of thinking? And what was their way of thinking collectively? Because Rashi points out, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki points out that this was the manner of all the people in that time. Lemech is just an example that the Bible shares with us. What was their way? Yeah, they had children, they had families. But what was their main objective? What was their main concern? What was their main, so to speak, occupation? In pursuing frivolous companionship. That's what was more important to them. Think about that first sin. What was the very, very first sin? The snake became jealous. He became envious. He became full of lust. He felt that he had a connection to mankind because he looked pretty similar, if you recall that class. Refer back to the first class. So what did he do? He wanted Chava for himself. Again, frivolous companionship / adultery. And this, albeit in a more refined manner, but it also has the air, it has that smell, it has that sense of adultery. What is really adultery at the end of the day? What it is basically saying, I want pleasure, and this is the way I'm going to get it. It's very frivolous. It's not with any idealistic, holy, lofty pursuit or intention. Not at all. It's about me. It's about pleasure. It's about enjoying myself. It's about me having fun, me having a good time. And that's what happened here. But then the verse continues, and what does it tell us? The next verse tells us that Ada, in fact, gave birth to a son, Yavel in Hebrew, or Jabal. And he was the father of those who dwelled in tents and drove cattle. Now I ask you, why? What is it telling us? Remember again, the Bible is not a history book. It's not just to tell us who invented this idea of living in tents. Or it's not to tell us that maybe that he was the father of the Bedouins. I don't know that he was. That's irrelevant, because that's not what the Torah, that's not what the Bible is attempting to tell us. In fact, in the next verse, what does it tell us? Ada gave birth to another son, because it tells us he had a brother. Now, it doesn't tell us she gave birth to another son. It says he had a brother. That means he's like an associate, somewhat in line with him. Not just happened to be born in the same family, but it is his brother. Like you say, a brother in crime. Well, maybe that's where it comes from. It was his brother. And who was his brother? This was the father of all those. He was the ancestor of all who played, like the father, the originator, the lyre and the pipe. So in fact, the sages tell us, and Rashi, again, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, he brings a commentary, and he tells us from the sources that what this really is telling us, that these two brothers, they were the fathers of idolatry. They actively set up, so to speak, the structure, the ideas, the ideals, the implementation of worship of idolatry. And when it says he was the father of the tents and those with the cattle, what it's referring to is the tents, the houses. He was the first one to make an elaborate place for idolatry. If anybody did or did not worship idols up till then, whether in the literal sense or figuratively, it wasn't done in a structured, in a formalized, so to speak, organized manner. He was the first one to organize the first church, the first house of worship for idols. His brother, he was the ancestor of all those who played the lyre. What is that? That's playing music for idols. Otherwise, who cares who was the first one to play the first instruments? What the Bible is telling us, what the Torah is telling us, is that these two were the originators of the formal service of idolatry. The next verse, it tells us Sila, that's the second wife, who was just here for frivolous purposes, but somehow, even though she, like Rashi told us before, even though she would take some kind of drugs or whatever in order for her not to have children, or not to have that many children, I guess some kind of birth control. But in this case, she did have a child. And what does the verse tell us? She gave birth to Tuval Cain. Now, this Tuval Cain, who was he? He was the first one he was the one who forged implements of copper and iron. Now I ask you, do you imagine that there were absolutely no implements at all of copper and iron prior to this? In other words, what would they plow with? If you recall, the land had already been cursed. And then it was cursed again by Cain's sin when he killed his brother. So they need all these tools, all these implements to work the ground. So what then is he the inventor of, or known, famous for, as the Torah describes him? What then could it be? Well, again, Rashi comes to the rescue. And Rashi tells us, do you know what this is telling us? His name was Tuval Cain. Tuval Cain. He was also the namesake of his great-great-grandfather, who was the first murderer in this world. The first murderer. There was no one before him. The first one to commit murder, in a sense, the inventor of murder. No one knew how to murder before that. And now his great-grandson, who's named after him, he is actually going to go in his ways. He is going to literally personify and bring to a whole different level his namesake. And what is that? He made implements of copper and iron, not implements to plow the ground and to harvest the weeds and to better human lives, but he was the first one to systematically develop weapons of destruction, weapons of murder, instruments of pain, of havoc. That's who he was. Thus, we have here the third sin, the sin of murder. Now, we can understand how later it continues, and it tells us, if you look in the verses, after it says that Cain was punished after 7 generations, fast forward to verse 26. Actually 25. 25, it tells us how Adam decided it's time to have more children, significant children, a significant child, a personality, somebody who will have an impact on future generations, because Hevel is gone. Remember, Hevel is gone. And now Cain is gone. So he gave birth to a son. And his son's name was Shase. And then it tells us in verse 26, Shase, he too, in turn, a son was born to him. And he named him Enosh. It was then that Hashem, meaning God's name, began to be invoked by name. That's the way it literally says. That's when they began That's what they started to evoke God's name. But again, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, comes to our rescue and explains what this means. And let me give you a little introduction. In Hebrew, like in other languages, there are different ways to say he started, he began, he initiated. Here, the Torah chooses somewhat of an obscure term in order to say, thus began the calling in the name of God, the evoking of God's name. It uses the term huchal. Listen to it carefully. Huchal. What does huchal mean? So Rashi tells us that huchal here is hinting to and comes from the root word chulin, which means mundane. They began to profane God's name. They began to mistreat God's name. They began to misuse God's name, and they started to call the names of their idols after God's name. By God's name. That's a picture of what was taking place at that time. So you see from all these three things, the first thing I went through, which was not absolute adultery, but certainly close to it. It has the smell, the markings of it when it's all about indulgence, especially when it comes to sexuality and so on. And then talking about the next generation, who they actually made houses of worship for idols and music. They made the music sheets, so to speak. They set up this idea of worship and how to pray to the idols and so on. And then Tuval Cain, who makes the instruments of death. He makes weapons at a mass scale in order, in a sense, to encourage or to celebrate the idea of killing other humans. And then, finally, you go back. Adam has a son, and it's his grandson, Enosh, who begins, not only does he worship idols, but he begins to call them in the name of God. He begins to profane God's name, to make it mundane, to evoke God's name loosely, but not just loosely, not just lightly, but in a wrong manner, applying it to the idols. Now, I want to focus in on this because the title of this class is Who's Really in Charge? And that's really the root of this issue, this problem with idolatry. See, because really we have to think about it. It doesn't make sense. If you think about it, something's wrong here. Who were these people who worship idols? It's not people who were 1,000, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years after creation, who don't see God, they don't hear God, they're looking for some spirituality, they're looking for some mysticism, they're looking for some inspiration, and perhaps they found the wrong thing. Perhaps they came to the wrong conclusions. It's wrong. It's certainly not right, but perhaps there's some room, if I may, at least logically, rationally, for forgiveness. They're not terrible. They're not bad. They're wrong, but they're not corrupted to the core. Perhaps. However, when you go back to these generations that we're talking about here, a grandson of Adam. So he definitely spoke to grandpa. I don't know, he saw him on Sundays, he saw him on Mondays. He saw him. They lived together. They didn't have distractions. They didn't have TVs. They didn't have tablets. They didn't have cell phones. They spoke to each other. He didn't hear from him about God. He didn't hear from him about the creation. He didn't hear from him what he saw in the Garden of Eden. So how do you go and worship idols? What's wrong with you? What is your problem? People who merited to see and to speak to these great original human beings with God, whom God made with his own hands, so to speak, God's handiwork, and they should go worship idols. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. One has to be insane to do that when they know the truth, because they saw the truth, or at least heard it from someone who saw the truth. So what happened? What really happened here? So if we look into Maimonides, the great sage, he actually gives us a short concise but very insightful, um, a very insightful depiction of what happened and how idolatry evolved, how it came about. And he tells us, and I'm not quoting verbatim, just paraphrasing it from memory. He tells us that the original idol worshippers, their mistake was, listen to this, their mistake, there was no intent over here to do anything bad, but their mistake was that they felt that God is so holy, God is so lofty, God is so beyond that he doesn't directly interact with the world. He doesn't directly interact with the world. It's impossible. Why would he? It doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to them. They were of the understanding that God left or perhaps delegated certain powers in the hands of the various strong celestial beings in the world or various powers that are in the world. And to an extent, they have a good point. Because if you look at the world, the sun has its effect, the moon has its effect. There are things that are accomplished through the wind, the water, the air, the atmosphere, the whole ecosystem. Then you have the angels, which they were well aware of. Then you have the stars, and you have all the heavens. There's so much going on. They felt like there was a whole hierarchy here. There was a system here that God put in place. Now, their original mistake was based on their reverence, their respect of God. The idea that God is not involved in this mundane, lowly world. God is too high. God is too great than to be involved in this lowly universe. Yes, he created it. It couldn't happen without him. But he's not directly involved. He's like I once used the example, he's the CEO. He's the president of the country. Think about it. If you got a problem, they forgot to pick up your garbage, are you going to call the White House? You're not going to call the White House. Technically speaking, it's under the White House because the White House is the authority, the seat of the rule of the whole country, or the Congress, House, Capitol, I mean. But you're not going to call there. You're going to call your local authority. You're not going to call even the mayor. You're not even going to call the council people. You're going to call the person in charge, and not even the head of the sanitation department. You're going to call the supervisor of that shift. That's how they felt. That's how they felt. God's unbelievable. God's so holy. God's so lofty. You think he's involved with the world? And therefore, their understanding led them to believe, led them to understand that this world is run by intermediaries. There are people in charge. There's a system. There's a whole system. There's a whole pyramid of power that broadens as it goes lower. But if you need something, if you want something, if you, so to speak, need something to get done, who do you turn to? To the one who can do it, or the one who's supposed to do it, the one who's meant to do it. So in their understanding, when they go and talk to or worship, let's say a star, the sun, the moon, or whatever power it is, they felt like, hey, this is the right way. This is what God wants from them. God wants that if you have a problem, don't call the boss, don't call the CEO, don't call the president of the United States. Call them. Talk to them. They're in charge. He put them in charge. And B, this is a way of honoring God by honoring his servants. By honoring his servants. In fact, if you think of it from this perspective, it comes from a very good place. In fact, there's a verse in the book of Psalms. There's a verse in the book of Psalms in chapter, I believe it's chapter 115, that it says over there, quote, the heavens are heavens to God, and the earth was given to mankind. That's how they understood it. Heavens, meaning the lofty things, that is closer to God. That is godly. But the earth was given to mankind. In other words, there is a divide, there's a separation, there's higher, there's lower. And therefore, it makes sense that God, who's so high, is not going to involve himself in so low. He's not going to get involved. He's not going to get dirty and in the trenches with the lowly beings of this world. Sounds like a justified, logical, rational idea. So what's wrong? Well, Maimonides tells us that over time, this evolved. The first generation or two, perhaps, they were of understanding that God is God. And there is a one God to this world. And it's only that those who are in charge, so to speak, God put them in their position, that they need to be worshipped or slash talked to, request things from them, and B, God needs to be respected. So respect his servants, right? Respect his managers, so to speak. Respect the supervisors that he put in place. And then later, Maimonides explained how that evolved into the great mistake where they began to worship the things itself and attribute powers and treat them as a deity, each and every one of them. And all the gods and the craziness all evolved from there. Why is this all wrong? Let's imagine that it never evolved into that mistake, that people just began to worship the things themselves. Let's say that they were able to maintain this tradition of the original thinkers, that God is God, but he put in intermediaries. What would have been wrong with that? Why does the Torah refer to these as the originators, the inventors of the houses of worship, of those who played music, of those who began to call God's name in vain? They began to disgrace God's name. What's so bad with it? The answer is there's a colossal mistake in their whole approach. And that's what undermines the whole thing. What was the mistake? They looked at God, thinking that God is so holy, so lofty, so great. But with that, they limited God. They looked at him from their finite perspective. Something that's finite means that it's limited. It has a limitation. It can be very, very great, but it's got a limitation. If you think about it, I mentioned the president before. President is fantastic. It's a great position, in charge of the security of the country and the welfare of all the beings in the country. But he's not reachable. And he shouldn't be reachable. He can't be talking to millions of people. He can't answer millions of phone calls. And he cannot be vulnerable to the masses. There has to be a hierarchy. There has to be a whole system that a relay. You can't just go to the president. You can't just go to the Supreme Justice. You can't. It's not supposed to be that way because they're finite beings. But God is infinite. In fact, he's even beyond that. So he's absolutely not limited. So if one could understand, if one could accept that God created the world and God is so holy, God could be in the heavens, he could also be in the earth at the same time. He can also be in the earth at the same time. And there's no need for that selfishness, which in a certain sense, I want you to think of it this way. Worshipping those intermediaries is a sense of selfishness. It's saying, what do I want? What could I get from this? What could I derive from this? What benefit is there for me? So if I worship them, if I'm good friends, if I'm buddies with them, if I find favor in their eyes, then I'm going to receive all the goodies, all the blessings that I'm seeking to obtain. That, again, is selfishness. That is everything separate from God. And that is such an important lesson for us. Again, if one truly believes in God, if God can be in the holiest place, then God can be at the same time in the most unholiest place of places. And if one doesn't believe that he can be in the most unholiest of places, then one does not believe that he can be in the holiest of places. God is in charge. God is everywhere. God is everything. And therefore, the fundamental belief in God, not in any intermediaries, not in any whatsoever vehicles that deliver God's blessings, and that godly energy, as God chooses to deliver it, as He sees fit. Any other thing, that's idol worship. It could be a refined idol worship, but it's idol worship. And what the Torah is telling us is, look where it began, look where it started. Maimonides is describing it to us not to tell us a nice story, but he's telling us, look at the dangers. It starts at a very lofty point. It starts with good intentions, with real, genuine, refined thinking, but human thinking. And look how vulnerable it is. Look how dangerous it is. Look where it could evolve, and look where it ends up in all the crazy, ridiculous idol worship, and all the crazy, ridiculous occults, and all the crazy, ridiculous paganism, and all that stuff, all because people try to understand God from their perspective, try to understand God and fit it into the human mind and make sense of it in a humanistic way. That is not God. That is not the God that we believe in. So to summarize, God is everywhere. God is everything. God is in charge of everything, everywhere, all the time, anytime. And therefore, there's no need to talk to the sun. There's no need to talk to the moon. Not only there's no need, it's forbidden. The moment one talks to them, that's an affront to God. That means that one doesn't believe in the true power of godliness, in the idea that God is infinite and beyond being infinite. A practical application of this, and it's very, very important, especially nowadays when people tend to really, really misuse and abuse words. Words almost don't mean anything. Almost everything is meaningless. People just say things. They don't mean it, and if they mean it, they don't say what they mean. We, especially in our society, tend to use God's name in the most wrongful of ways. For example, someone gets hurt. Oh my God! I'm using it for illustration purposes. I'm using it for teaching purposes. Well, really, one should not do that. God's name, in any language, you should know, not just in the original Hebrew, not just in the original Torah language, but God's name in any language that has a reference to this higher being known as God, and usually and any language whatever language it may be, it's obvious. It's usually very clear and obvious. Nobody has to elaborate that this is a reference to God or to the Lord or to the Almighty. One really should not utter God's name in vain. As it says in this verse, that's when they began to call in God's name. But remember what the term it used. They began to profane his name, in a sense. That it was huchal coming from the root word mundane. They used it cheaply. They used it without real reverence. This is a lesson that we need to refrain from misusing God's name. We need to be careful about showing the proper reverence to God's name, and only use it in a context and in a time when it's absolutely necessary, and it's done with holiness. It's done with true reverence, with true respect. In fact, this is not only when one's talking, in other words, when one is verbally saying God's name, But in fact, even in writing, when one is writing, one should be careful that if they write God's name, that has a certain holiness to it. God, or even the word Almighty. Almighty is not a reference to any human being. It's a reference to Him, capital H. So one writes that. One should not discard that. One cannot throw that out. That becomes somewhat sacred, holy. So what then can one do? One should perhaps write G-D. So omit the O, so it's not fully God's name. Or you're writing Almighty, typically you would write A, capital A that is, obviously, dash, hyphen, L, mighty. A dash Almighty. Something like that. Lord, if you're writing the Lord not as the Lord in England, but Lord as the Lord, you would write again L-R-D. Because if that ends up in the garbage, it ends up in a place that is not so clean, not so holy, then you were not you were not profaning, and you were not defaming and disgracing God's name. It's a very, very important lesson. And perhaps you see how things got into society when people even use certain terminology that they don't even realize what they're saying because someone saw it somewhere in a history book or in some literature and repeated it. And people who are repeating it after them have no idea what the origin of it is. And people let the Greek gods, bestow their wrath on you. His expression is, you should be really hurt. Greek gods, they don't exist. There's no such thing. You're not allowed to say that. It doesn't, I said it for purpose of illustration, but it doesn't exist. Or they say, God, damn it. What's going on here? You can't say that. It's not only it's not appropriate, it's not proper, it's forbidden. And so on and so forth. Of course, who knows, maybe even something like American Idol. Does that sound right to you? American Idol? Can't it be like American Star or American Great or American Heroes or American Super Talent? I don't know, something like that. American Idol? Idol is synonymous with idolatry. Why call it that? You see how it seeped into society. People don't even know what they're saying. They don't even realize the connotation of it. They just say it. And that is a very important step. Perhaps one of the first steps in getting closer to God. Just having reverence, having respect, having the proper attitude when it comes to using or misusing God's name. And that is our way of not making the mistake of the idol worshippers. Again, should you have any questions, please, and comments or what have you, I really would encourage you to write us at askme@torahquestions.com or visit us at bnacademy.org. Looking forward to seeing you at the next class.